What a Baptist crowd we have today. Definitely Baptist crowd. Arriving late and enjoying talking. That's Baptist. Uh, so we'll. But even so, Baptists love the Word of God. So we're going to be looking at the book of Isaiah again today. Remember, we're making our way through this book, and just to remind you, really why we're studying Isaiah. Isaiah it is in the Old Testament, it is a view of God's redemptive plan. It does a lot of things. First of all, it sits at a very important point in history. So this is written in the 8th century BC, and Israel is a divided kingdom. And so you've got the 10 northern tribes that they're called Israel. They retain that name. The 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin are the nation of Judah. Now Isaiah is prophesying largely down in the southern kingdom. He's in Jerusalem, but he's not prophesying exclusively to the southern kingdom. He's going to prophesy against, sometimes he calls them Samaria. That's part of the northern kingdom. And so Isaiah is looking at, first of all, he's looking at history, how Israel got here to this place where the people of God have divided and they are in sin and rebellion against God. You have a succession of many different kings after the kingdom splits. And so Isaiah, he's prophesying to a fragmented society, a divided people, and a culture that is in disarray. And one of the big problems is that the king, remember in Isaiah begins during the reign of Uzziah, and chapter 6 was the death of Uzziah. He's going to prophesy really during the reign of 4 different kings of Judah. And the problem after the death of Uzziah is that all these kings are looking to political alliances, military alliances to get them out of their problem. So they're not turning to the Lord. They're not asking God for help. They're asking Pharaoh of Egypt and Tiglath-Pileser and of the Assyrians and different armies and nations around them, and because their land is a very coveted land. It's on the bridge. I have a book about the archaeology of Israel, and it's called the Sacred Bridge. And indeed, what a description that is. It is a sacred bridge. It bridges Asia on the one hand down into Africa and what we consider really the Middle East. And it's a strategic place. So there's going to be battles over it. And the kings of Judah and of Israel know that. And so they think that the solution is for them to turn to these foreign kings and armies. But of course, if you do that, you basically enslave yourself. If you turn to a foreign king and you say, enter into this league with us, well, he wants something out of it. He's not just going to send his men to die on your behalf just out of the goodness of his heart and to be a good neighbor. He's going to want taxes. He's going to want tribute. He's going to want to put his governors in place. And this is why Isaiah warns them so strongly. So we've looked at the book thus far, and the first week we looked at really chapters 1 through 5, Isaiah's prophecy about God's judgment on Judah. And then the second week we looked at chapters 8 and 9, Judah's true hope. That's where we saw there in the prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. There will be to you a virgin shall conceive, and she'll give this sign in chapter 7 and chapter 8 and 9. We had the fulfillment of that in Isaiah's day. But remember, we've shared how Isaiah is always looking at 2 things. He's looking at his immediate situation, But then with the eye of prophecy, the Spirit is revealing to him how this is really a shadow of the future, that the Messiah is going to come. So there's going to be another child born of a virgin that is going to be the one upon whom the government rests on his shoulders. So on the third week, we looked at the 10 burdens of the nations, and his burden of Babylon, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Egypt, the desert of the sea, Dumah, which means silence, Arabia, the valley of vision. And we saw that there Isaiah is looking at things that are near and then things that are distant. And maybe in the near future, the players are sort of the same, but he looks further down in the distance. And he uses these strange names like Dumah, silence, and the valley of vision. And we see that now he's looking further out in the future about the coming of the Messiah, what we know as the second coming. And over, he uses this phrase, the day of the Lord, in that day, on the day of the Lord, throughout those chapters. And then last week we looked at God's sovereignty manifested in salvation and judgment. He's going to judge the entire earth in chapter 24, and this salvation embraces the world, chapters 25, 26, 27. Today, we're going to look at what is a very discrete section, and it is really begins in chapter 28 and goes through chapter 33, and it's 6 woes that he pronounces on peoples and nations. Some people in Israel or Judah, some nations outside. Now, who else in the Bible do we see pronounce woes on people? You remember? Jesus does. That's right. In Matthew 23, Jesus pronounces all those woes on the Pharisees, the scribes, the hypocrites. Well, where does Jesus get that language? Well, he gets it from Isaiah. Now, let's be clear, Isaiah ultimately gets it from Jesus. But what my point is that Jesus is standing in a tradition. Remember, in Jesus, we see all those offices of the Old Testament. Jesus is priest. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He's a king. He's the son of David. But he's also the great prophet. God promised in the day of Moses, he said, I'm going to raise up another prophet like you. And when Moses dies, we're sad at the death of Moses, but we also know there's one greater than Moses who's coming. We know that there's a prophet greater than Moses. There's a son of David greater than David. And there's a priest greater than Aaron who's coming. Jesus is the fulfillment of all 3 prophecies, prophet, priest, and king. Now, that's impossible in the Old Testament. Why? Why is that impossible to have any one person that's all 3? Well, to be the priest, you have to come from what tribe? Levi. And to be a king, you come from Judah, right? Now, prophets can come from pretty much any tribe, and they came from different ones. But you can't have somebody who's a Levite and of the tribe of Judah. That's completely contradictory. And that's why in the New Testament, and even in the book of Psalms, it's stressed that the Messiah is going to be a priest after the order, not of Aaron, but of Melchizedek, who's a priest forever, totally outside of the Aaronic priesthood. So Jesus meets all of that. So Isaiah, as he prophesies these woes, because we're New Testament believers and we've already read the book of Matthew, we can't help but see echoes of what Jesus is going to do when he pronounces woes upon people. So Jesus fulfills this same prophetic office. So let's turn to it, and we're just going to, no way we can read all of these chapters, but I'm going to just look at sort of at least the beginning of each chapter and sort of show you the general tone of what Isaiah is doing in each one. So the first woe, by the way, all these woes have one thing in common, and that is that they're somehow related to the city of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is if you were here Wednesday night, we talked about Psalm 24. God's holy hill of Mount Zion is in Jerusalem. This is where the temple, in Isaiah's day, the temple sits there on the Temple Mount. Solomon's temple is still there. This is before it's destroyed. And so this is the place that where God dwells in both type and in a sense in reality, physically among his people there in Jerusalem. But they're defiling Jerusalem. They're turning to the other alliances and gods. And so here are the woes pronounced on them about the unfaithfulness of Jerusalem. The first woe is against the drunkards of Ephraim and Judah. And Ephraim would stand for remember, the northern kingdom. Anytime you read Ephraim, that means the nation of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. This is what's called a synecdoche, so that Ephraim stands for, it's taken with all of the nation, and Judah is the southern kingdom. So he says, the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. Notice this interjection that begins at You're going to see that several times in these woes. It could be translated woe to, as it does some translations. So woe to, or the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is on the head of the rich valley of those overcome with wine. So he says, look at this. God has so blessed you. You've got all this riches. God's the one who's given you the fertile valley. And God's the one who has produced the grape for you and put a crown on your head. And what do you do with it? You get drunk. You abuse God's good gifts to you. And you're overcome. Behold, the Lord has one who is mighty and strong, like a storm of hail, a destroying tempest, like a storm of mighty overflowing waters. He casts down to the earth with his hand. The proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim will be trodden underfoot. And the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is on the head of the rich valley, will be like a first ripe fig before the summer. When someone sees it, he swallows it as soon as it is in his hand. So look at the imagery, the beautiful poetry of Isaiah, even as he's describing the way the northern kingdom, Ephraim, is going to be devoured. God has blessed them, and he's given them the harvest, but without any gratitude to God, they've devoured it. They've become drunkards. And he says, so there's going to be another harvest. It's going to be like the harvest of figs. Now, Tanya and I, every time we go to Israel, we take a group, we always try and find, if we're there at the right season, ripe figs to give. And you get a fig, and you can eat ripe figs, and they're delicious. So what Isaiah says is, you're going to be like the first ripe fig. Somebody sees a ripe fig. They've been without figs for months. It's not been the season for figs, and they see one ripe fig. What do? They pluck it, and they eat it as soon as they get it. They say, here it is, man. I have been waiting for this fruit, and you devour it. He says that's exactly the way that the Lord is going to devour Ephraim. But now look at verse 5. Here's that phrase, in that day. So remember, Isaiah is looking at two things. He's looking at the judgment that is going to come upon Ephraim in just a few years. Assyria is going to conquer Ephraim, or the northern kingdom of Israel. But Isaiah is also looking, he sees these judgments of the Lord that come now are all anticipatory of the great judgment of the Lord that's going to come when what you and I know as the return of Christ, what's described in the book of Revelation. the day of the Lord. In that day, the Lord of hosts will be a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people, and a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, and strength to those who turn back the battle at the gate. And so here's this glimpse of God's purpose. He's going to judge these people now, but one day he's going to come and he's going to judge all wickedness. He's going to reveal his glory, and there's going to be a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment. Look at verse 14. Therefore hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers who rule this people in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we've made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come to us. Now, I just want you to see the foolishness that Isaiah is pointing out. Here, Isaiah is urging them to turn to the Lord, but they say, oh no, we're okay, I'm good. Well, why are you good? Because I've struck a bargain with death. When death comes in the land, it's going to pass through here. It's not going to, the whip of death won't get us because we have an agreement. Now that's foolish, isn't it? Because the one thing you can be certain of is that death, if Jesus doesn't return, death's going to get every one of us. Tomorrow, I will have the service for Gene Brown right here in this very sanctuary. Gene, who's been so faithful among us and served us on Wednesday nights for so many years and been a faithful deacon and in this church, just an amazing man. And he died. And you know what? There's going to be service like that for me one day. There's going to be a service like that for you one day. We're all going to face death. What a foolish thing for us to say, oh, no, I'm good. I've struck a bargain with death. Death's going to not sting me. Well, you can say that all you want. It's just not going to work. But if we turn to Christ, we have entered into the one who has conquered death. And then we don't need fear death. It's a very different thing. And so he says here, because you say you've made a covenant with death, it's not going to come to you. You've made lies our refuge, and falsehood we've taken shelter. Therefore, says the Lord God, behold, I am the one who has laid as a foundation in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not be in haste or will not be ashamed. I will make justice the line and righteousness the plumb line, and hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and water will overwhelm the shelter. So he says, I am going to lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, and you are either going to be on the rock or you're going to be crushed by the rock. And this is the only way you can defeat death. You can't defeat death by turning to any foreign powers. And so all of chapter 28 is more of this kind of prophecy against those that have taken God's blessing and they've gotten drunk on it. They're not grateful for it. They don't turn to him in their need. God says he's going to send judgment. And judgment is, as we know, the cornerstone of whom he speaks, also prophesied in Psalm 118. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So God is going to see how Isaiah uses that same imagery. The one whom they reject, they don't turn to God, they turn to these kings. And so they're rejecting God's cornerstone and turning to earthly powers. And he says, well, I'm going to lay a cornerstone in Zion, and whoever believes in him won't be ashamed. Whoever believes in him won't be so quick to turn to these foreign powers. Chapter 29 is the second woe, and it's a woe against the hypocrites of Ariel. Now look at verse 1. Or woe Ariel, Ariel. Now, where's Ariel? Have you ever heard this before? There's only a couple of other places where that word is used in the Old Testament. And we may say, I don't know where this is. Is this another time that Isaiah is using something to describe, he's using a word to describe something future? But it's clear from the context he's talking about Jerusalem because he calls it the city where David encamped. And so Isaiah is looking at David making Jerusalem the capital. Add year to year, let the feast run their round. Yet I will distress Ariel, or Jerusalem. There shall be moaning and lamentation, and she shall be to me like an Ariel. So this is a word play. Ariel could mean, Ariel could mean the lion of God. And so he's saying that she will be like a lion to him. Again, it's one of Isaiah's many puns and word plays, and some of them we don't even get because of the context, but we get the general meaning. There's no question about the overall meaning of what he's saying, but we may not understand every little word play because it's a little bit obscure to us. But what he's saying is that he's going to judge Jerusalem. Again, before Jesus dies, what does he do? He looks over Jerusalem and he pronounces basically judgment on Jerusalem. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." Now listen to that language. Ariel, Ariel. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. You who stoned the prophets. How often would I have gathered you like a hen gathers her chicks, and you would not. So you see, Jesus, 800 years after Isaiah, has Jerusalem changed? Have they learned the lesson? Have they accepted the word of Isaiah? No, this is what Jesus says. No, you're the ones who stoned the prophets. You don't listen to the prophets. And remember, Jesus told the parable about the owner of the vineyard who kept sending his servants. And what do? They would abuse his servants. And so finally he sends his son, and they take the son and they kill him. They won't receive his word. And indeed, 800 years later, that's exactly what happened, what took place. So, verse 4, you will be brought low, from the earth you shall speak. Well, let me back up and look at verse 3. I will encamp against you all around. So how does Jerusalem fall? In 536, Jerusalem falls to a siege. Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem, and it falls. And then what does Titus do in AD 70? He surrounds Jerusalem. And Jesus had warned in his day of that happening. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see the armies gathered, you better take flight. You better pray it doesn't happen on the Sabbath. You better hope it doesn't happen in the winter. And Jesus was prophesying what Titus was going to do in AD 70 and how he was going to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. Jesus said, I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. And indeed, that's exactly what the Roman army did in AD 70. So again, you see this parallel between Isaiah and Jesus, both warning a rebellious and recalcitrant Jerusalem of God's judgment coming upon them because they did not accept his overtures of love and instruction. And though he gave his blessing, they took his harvest and turned it into drunkenness. They took his cornerstone and they would not build on it. They would not turn to him. And so they've been judged. In both cases, they were surrounded, and God said that he would do that. Verse 4, you will be brought low. From the earth you shall speak, and from the dust your speech will be bowed down. Your voice shall come from the ground like the voice of a ghost. And from the dust your speech shall whisper. Uh, the, but the multitude of your foreign foes shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the ruthless like passing chaff. So God says, all right, I'm going to judge you, but I'm going to judge them too. So you are hypocrites because you claim to be my people, but you turn against me. So I'm going to judge you, and I'm going to judge, look at verse 7, the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ariel. All that fight against her and her stronghold and distress her shall be like a dream, a vision of the night, as when a hungry man dreams. And behold, he's eating and awakes with his hunger not satisfied. You know, you can have a dream of eating a feast, but when you wake up, you're not full. You just imagine that. And God said, all the things that you are thinking are going to satisfy you are just basically dreams. Down in verse 15 is the third woe, and it's the woe against the evil schemers of Jerusalem. Here it is. You who hide deep from the Lord your counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us? Who knows us? You turn things upside down. He said, you think you're in control. You think you can do something and not be seen and not be known. You think you're getting away with something. He said, but you think you've turned things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay, that the thing made should say of its maker, he did not make me? What a foolish thing. Paul uses this argument in Romans 9. He refers to this. He looks back at this. Remember, when he's talking about the sovereignty of God and God's right to make one out of the same clay, he can make one vessel for honor and another to dishonor. And Paul can hear the theological objections coming from his readers. Hey, wait a minute. If indeed God is doing what he wants, if God's truly sovereign in all this stuff, then how can anybody find fault with God? Isn't everybody just simply doing what God said they would do anyway, if he's really in control of all things? And that's a good question. I'd really love to hear Paul's extended answer on that. But Paul does not satisfy us. He just says, you don't even get to ask that question. He says, who are you to reply against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why did you make me like this? And so he's looking back here at this chapter in Isaiah where he says, what we want to do, we want to turn it upside down and say, no, I am the captain of my fate. I am the master of my soul. People love that poem, Invictus. They think it's some great declaration of autonomy and independence. And if there's anything that people in this culture and at this age really, really love and admire, it's the illusion that they are autonomous. We want autonomy. We want to declare our own identity. We want to declare the terms of marriage. We want to declare the terms of gender and sexuality and all that. And man, if someone says they're a certain gender, then you got to say, well, okay, that's what you are. And if they say they're a certain ethnicity, even though they don't have any of that DNA in them or very, very, very little, they say, okay, that's what you are. You sort of you're autonomous. God laughs at that. God says, you're trying to turn things upside down. You're trying to say that you made yourself. But he says, there's a potter and then there's the clay. And the clay didn't make the potter, and the clay does not get to declare itself independent of the potter. The clay is completely dependent on the potter. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay? And the thing made should say of its maker, he did not make me? Or the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding. Man, this is the age in which we live, isn't it? And we're looking at our maker and saying, oh, you don't get it. You don't understand. Uh, I know what it says about you making two in the garden and male and female and all that, but clearly you just don't understand. And we want to declare our independence of the Maker. God says in verse 17, "Is it not yet a very little while until Lebanon shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be regarded as a forest? In that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see." There's that phrase again. In that day. So God says there's going to come a day of judgment. You can declare yourself independent of the Maker all you want, but there's going to be a day of reckoning when all stand before him, and God is going to make even the enemies of those that are against his people, he's going to make them bloom if in his providence he wants to do that. Verse 19, "The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel." God says, I'm going to do a work that goes beyond Israel. I'm going to do something that is global in its scope. "For the ruthless shall come to nothing, and the scoffer cease, and all who watch to do evil shall be cut off." So he began this section by saying, you scheme. You think nobody sees. You think nobody knows. You think you're independent of the will of God. But I want you to know there's coming a day of reckoning. And verse 22, "Therefore thus says the Lord, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob. Jacob shall be no more ashamed, no more shall his face grow pale. For when he sees his children, the work of my hands in his midst, they will sanctify my name." Now I want to stop there and just say, Isaiah is invoking a shameful history. Do you remember Jacob? Jacob, the brother of Esau, and he ends up with two wives. You remember the story, how he works for 14 years total to get Rachel, and he gets stuck with Leah in the deal. Poor Leah, what that must have felt like to her to know that he never really wanted her, and he'd worked 14 years to get his sister. And then, of course, they each have a handmaid that he has children with. So Jacob ends up with 12 sons that become the patriarchs, the eponymous leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. And remember, as Jacob goes through, he lives in a tent. They never live in a house. What do these sons do? What's the character of these sons of Jacob? Well, they turn on their brother, right? They sell Joseph into slavery. Remember, they had a sister. What's the name of the sister? Dinah. I think I'm right on that, am I not? Dinah, sister. And she gets, depending on how you interpret it, either seduced or raped by a guy that is lovesick for her, a Gentile guy in a little village there. And to get revenge on him, the brothers say to all the men of that village, "Hey, why don't we just be one people? We'll just live here with you guys. I mean, clearly our sister is now going to marry one of you, and we want to be one people. But, we believe in this covenant of circumcision. And so in order for us to be one people, all the men have to agree to be circumcised." Now, it's one thing for a 4-day-old baby to be circumcised. It's another thing for a grown man to be circumcised. And especially that you're talking before any such thing as anesthetic or antiseptics and antibiotics, and you're using Flintstones to do the deal. So this basically renders the men of the village completely incapacitated for a few days. And it was during their incapacity that the sons of Jacob go in and murder the whole village. They just kill them. Now, how'd you like to be the dad of that bunch? Would you be proud of your sons for mass murder? I mean, they don't just get vengeance on the guy that soiled their sister. They kill everybody. And there's a lot of shameful stuff. I mean, they sell their brother into slavery. This is why when they later show up down in Egypt and Joseph is the prime minister, man, when they find out who he is, they're not happy at the reunion. They're still scared to death. And even then when their dad dies, they think, okay, now he's going to kill us. I mean, these guys have got so much bad stuff in their background that it's hard for them to ever really understand or comprehend grace. Now, with that in your mind, what we read in Genesis about the sons of Jacob, now read this passage again. Here's what the Lord, who redeemed Abraham, says concerning the sons of Jacob. Jacob shall no more be ashamed. No more shall his face grow pale. For when he sees his children, the work of my hands in his midst, they will sanctify my name. Now that's incredible. These guys that were so deceitful, so vengeful, so often, I think we could use the word wicked. God says because of his work, they're going to sanctify his name. They will sanctify the Holy One of Jacob and will stand in awe of the God of Israel. And those who go astray in spirit will come to understanding, and those who murmur will accept instruction. God says, I'm going to purify my people. Eventually, I'm going to do a work in their hearts and in their lives that they understand who I am. They understand my holiness. And thus concludes the third woe. The fourth woe begins in verse 1 of chapter 30, goes throughout that whole chapter, and that's the woe is against the revolters against Yahweh, those that revolt against Yahweh. And particularly here, what he has in view in chapter 30 is that they want to trust in Egypt. Now, where did God deliver the Israelites from originally? He delivered them from Egypt. Now, hundreds of years later, they're wanting to turn back to Egypt. They're wanting to go to Egypt where God delivered them from, and they think, oh, now Egypt can help us. Well, God delivered you from them to begin with. Trust in him now, he'll deliver you again. But they don't. So he says, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine. Now you need to highlight that right there. That's just a great phrase, because I think that's the way we live a lot of our lives. Exactly like that. We're carrying out a plan, but it's not the Lord's. It's our plan. How often do we make plans and we don't consult the Lord? We don't pray about it. We don't lay it before the Lord. We don't think about how we can serve the Lord. I mean, just think about this. In our culture, we plan our whole lives for retirement. And how many people strategize so that in their retirement they can serve the Lord more and do more for the Lord than they've ever done? We've got the baby boom generation that's aging out right now, retiring every day, more boomers retiring and going into retirement. And if all you're doing in retirement is just resting on your laurels and enjoying the money you've accumulated, that's your plan. That's not necessarily the Lord's, right? So I'm just using one example here. There are a lot of ways we could apply this. It's true of our work life. It's true of our retirement. It's true of having children. I mean, why do you do what you're doing? So often we make our plan and we don't have any notion in it of how we can use that and maximize that for the glory of Christ and for the spread of the gospel. So why don't we start taking our plans before the Lord? Lord, show me, help me. I want to use this for you. How can I maximize this for you? God calls the children that do otherwise stubborn children who carry out a plan, but not mine, who make an alliance, But look at this, but not of my spirit. What's the alliance we really need to make? It's with the Spirit of God. I want to be controlled by the Spirit, not by someone else, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh. It's like God is amazed. The protection of Pharaoh. I had to deliver you from Pharaoh. Why would you think you're going to get protection from Pharaoh? He wants your land. He wants your resources. He wants you to be his slaves again. Why are you going to him for refuge? To seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn to your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation. For though his officials are at Zoan and his envoys reach Hanes, everyone comes to shame. So he's already sent his ambassadors up there. And he's saying, yeah, let's strike a deal. I'll help you out. Yeah, I'm your friend. And he says, everyone comes to shame through a people that cannot profit them. And so the rest of that chapter is about their rebellion in this way, and how they think they're going to defeat their enemies because of Egypt's help. But look at verse 18. Therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you, and therefore he exalts himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. For a people shall dwell in Zion, in Jerusalem. You shall weep no more. He will surely be gracious to you at the sound of your cry. As soon as he hears it, he answers you. Look down at verse 23. And he will give you rain for the seed with which you sow the ground, and bread, the produce of the ground, which will be rich and plenteous. In that day, your livestock will graze in large pastures, and the oxen and the donkeys that work the ground will eat seasoned fodder, which has been winnowed with the shovel and the fork. He said, I'm going to give you such a harvest, and I'm going to take care of you. He said, the moment you call for me, I answer. He's just waiting for them to turn to him. Isaiah's prophecy here is that don't seek help from Egypt. Trust in the Lord. As soon as you call on him, he'll answer you. And yet, they don't do that. And then look at chapter 31. The fifth woe is woe to those who go down to Egypt. These are the unholy alliance makers. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they're very strong. But do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. He's saying Egypt is no help. The Lord will deliver you. Look at verse 3. The Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble. That is, so you're going to Egypt for help. The minute God stretches out his hand against Egypt, they're going to fall. They are men, their horses are flesh, and God just has to say the word. You know, this is one, I love reading a little bit about military theory, war theory, how to conduct war. And one of the things that I have learned is that war is it's not just X's and O's. It's not just where you put your armies and how many munitions you have. War is things like the truck that gets stuck in the mud so that the troop carriers can't get around and get to the front. War is things like an outbreak of flu that you didn't plan on, and suddenly half your army is they've got diarrhea and can't fight very well. I mean, this is what war is. God says, I just have to stretch out my hand. They're men. Their horses are flesh. I can send foot and mouth disease and knock these guys down. It doesn't take an army to do it. I can take care of them. You need to trust in me instead of in them. He's warning them. You're putting your trust in something that ultimately cannot deliver you. Verse 4, thus the Lord said to me, as a lion or a young lion growls over his prey, and when a band of shepherds is called out against him, he's not terrified by their shouting or daunted at their noise. He's like, here's a lion that's got a sheep, and he's growling over that sheep. This is his prey. A bunch of shepherds come out hollering at it. He doesn't care. And that noise isn't going to bother him. He's not terrified by their shouts. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight on Mount Zion and on its hill. Like birds hovering, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. He will spare and rescue it. Turn to him from whom people have deeply revolted, O children of Israel. For, here it is again, in that day everyone shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which your hands have sinfully made for you. So God says there's going to come a day when I'm going to deliver Jerusalem, and they'll no more turn against me. They'll no more turn to any foreign armies or gods, and all the idols that have so infested my people will be gone. The Assyrian shall fall by a sword, not of man, and a sword not of man shall devour him. God said, I'm not going to use an army to defeat Assyria. I'm going to use my judgment. He shall flee from the sword. His young men shall be put to forced labor. His rock shall pass away in terror, and his officers desert the standard in panic. Declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace in Jerusalem. God said, no, I'm going to protect my people, and I'm going to deal with those that you fear and those whom you put your trust in. You don't need to fear anybody but me, and you shouldn't trust anyone but me. And then in chapter 32, you have still really as a part of this fifth woe is the prophecy of the true blessedness that will come. He says, behold, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm. So God says there's going to come a day when my king will rule in righteousness, and his princes will rule with him. Now think again about how many times you've seen a king whose sons were not righteous. I mean, David, even the great David. Remember, Absalom tried to revolt. In fact, he revolted against David. He tried to get the people to love him, and he would stand outside when David would render a judgment, and he'd say to somebody, boy, it's a shame you got that I would have given you justice if you'd only come to me. And he revolted against David. And then he murders another brother. And then at the end, after the death of David, when Solomon becomes king, and Solomon puts Adonijah to death. And there's you see the sons of kings don't behave in righteousness. But God says there's coming a day when his king's going to rule, and the princes will rule in righteousness. Now, who's that? That's you and me. What are we? We're heirs and joint heirs with Christ. We are co-regents with him. We will reign with him. And so as Jesus, our elder brother, rules, we're going to rule with him. And we're going to be part of that righteous remnant because of our faith in him. And the rest of that goes down through verse 8. He talks about the blessedness that will come. And then he speaks to the complacent women in verses 9 through the rest of the chapter and warns them of the disaster that's coming so that they turn to him as well. And then chapter 33 is the sixth woe. The sixth and final woe here is against the Assyrian spoiler, the destroyer from Assyria. And he says, you destroyer, who yourself have not been destroyed, you traitor, whom none has betrayed. When you have ceased to destroy, you will be destroyed. Now, look at that. Isaiah says Assyria is going to win for a while. They're going to destroy, they're going to take captive the people of God. They're going to move against Samaria, against Ephraim, against the northern kingdom of Israel, and take them captive. And God's going to let them win for a while. But that temporary victory is going to end in their total destruction. God allows nations to do his will, but he still requires justice and judgment. And he will destroy them and bring them to nothing. So this is his word against Assyria. Verse 2, O Lord, be gracious to us. We wait for you. Be our arm every morning, our salvation in the time of trouble. At the tumultuous noise, peoples flee. When you lift up yourself up, nations are scattered, and your spoil is gathered as the caterpillar gathers, as locust leap is leapt upon. So he's saying, Isaiah is now speaking on behalf of the people and calling out to God. When he hears that God's going to judge Assyria, even though Assyria will be given victory, he says, Lord, be gracious to us. I know you're going to judge us, but in your judgment be gracious. And God is gracious even in his judgment because he allows a remnant to survive. Where are the Edomites? Nowhere. There's no remnant of Edomites that live to this day. Where are the Moabites? Well, they're nowhere. Where are the Philistines? They don't exist. God allowed some peoples to be completely wiped out or absorbed. And yet, he left a remnant of the Jewish people as a picture of the way he leaves a remnant of his people always and at all times. And God says in verse 10, I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will lift myself up. Now I will be exalted. You conceive chaff. You give birth to stubble. Look at the imagery here. What a mix of metaphors. Giving birth to the hulls of wheat grains. What do? You separate the wheat from the chaff. You don't want chaff. God says, for all your labors to produce, it's like giving birth to chaff. You're not producing children. You're producing waste. That's all you're good for. Down in verse 13, hear you who are far off what I've done, and you who are near acknowledge my might, that sinners in Zion are afraid. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can dwell with a consuming fire? Now, the writer to the Hebrews picks up on this and talks about our God being a consuming fire. Who among us can dwell with everlasting burnings? He who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, who despises the gain of oppressions, who shakes his hands lest they hold a bribe, who stops his ears from hearing of bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking on evil. Now there are echoes here of Psalm 1. You hear that? The blessed man who doesn't walk in the way of sinners or sit in the seat of the scornful. His delight is in the Lord. In his law he meditates day and night. He does not strike hands with the wicked. And here he says, this is who has God's favor. Well, who's that? Well, we know there's only one man who perfectly does that, and that's Jesus. He will dwell on the heights. His place of defense will be the fortresses of rocks. His bread will be given him. His water will be sure. And lest we have any question, verse 17, your eyes will behold the King in his beauty. So God is going to reveal his righteous King, the one who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, who shakes his hands lest they hold a bribe. He will not spoil himself with sin. Isaiah says, your eyes are going to behold the King in his beauty. They will see a land that stretches afar. Your heart will muse on the terror. Where is he who counted? Where is he who weighed the tribute? So in other words, the foreign nations that came in and collected taxes because they were oppressing God's people. Isaiah says the day's going to come where you're going to go, where'd those guys go? Where are the tax collectors? Where are the ones that weighed our tribute that we had to pay? Where is he who counted the towers? You will see no more the insolent people, the people of an obscure speech that you cannot comprehend. So all these foreign nations have come in and they've occupied Israel and they've collected tribute and taxes from Israel. Even in the day of Jesus, there was Rome. And that's why people hated the publicans. They were the tax collectors on behalf of Rome. And Isaiah says, the day's coming when you're not going to, those foreign languages aren't going to be there anymore. The tax collectors aren't going to be there anymore. Behold Zion, the city of our appointed feast. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an untroubled habitation, an immovable tent, whose stakes will never be plucked up, nor will any of its cords be broken. And how does the book of Revelation end? John sees a new, what? Jerusalem coming down out of heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. And the people of God are the new Jerusalem. And God is always going to dwell with his people. There'll be no need of sun by day nor moon by night because Jesus is the light. There is a river of water, pure water. You know, in old Jerusalem, water was always a problem because it's up on a hill, right? And you got to have a water source. There's no water source, no river. You never heard of, the river of Jerusalem. You got that dinky little brook Kidron that flows by, and it is dinky. It's a ditch. The Elkhorn Creek looks majestic compared to the brook Kidron. I'm serious. It's a drainage ditch, and that's all it is. There's no water source there. Water was always a problem, so they had to. Down at the foot of that hill, so you got Mount Zion up here and the city of David coming down here. Down at the bottom here, there's a spring. And Hezekiah, in his day, dug a tunnel. So they dug a tunnel so they could get to that spring from inside Jerusalem, because all any enemy had to do was just go put an army on that spring, and you cut off the whole city from their water source. So water was always a strategic problem for Jerusalem. Well, what about the New Jerusalem? Read it in the book of Revelation. There is a river of living water that comes right out of the throne of God, dwelling in the middle of his people. Water's no problem. So you've got the righteous king, the king in his beauty, verse 17. Zion, the beautiful city, in verse 20. Verse 21, there the Lord in majesty will be for us a place of broad rivers and streams. You see that? The Lord will be the source of our rivers and streams. A place of broad rivers and streams where no galley with oars can go. No enemy is going to bring his ship. By the way, remember the Philistines, the Phoenicians were the seagoing people and a constant enemy of Israel. and they would come with their ships. Israelites were not a seafaring people. And so they didn't know how to fight against these ships with oars. Isaiah says, don't worry about that. In the New Jerusalem, no galleys of oars can get to us. The Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. He will save us. And look at the last verse, verse 24. No inhabitant will say, I am sick. The people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity. What a beautiful glimpse. So see how gracious God is, that even in these 6 woes, he's pronouncing judgment on all these different groups. And yet, how many times in these 6 woes did we see this intercalary pronouncement of God's grace? Hey, but if you call to me, I'll answer right away. Hey, I'm going to send my cornerstone. I'm going to lay him in Zion. Hey, you're going to see the king in his beauty. Hey, a remnant's going to make it through. I'm going to deal with those that have oppressed you. Over and over and over, even in his judgment, God promises, I'm going to be faithful. You might be faithless. I will be faithful. I'm going to be gracious. And so Isaiah gives us this beautiful picture. Now remember, from Isaiah's day, looking at the future, we see all this as sort of one, it looks like one event. Everything happens together. But we know now on this side of it, some of it was fulfilled in the first coming of Christ. Some of it, like here, I'm telling you, look at the book of Revelation. This is still yet to be fulfilled. Some of it has been fulfilled. Have we seen the King in his beauty? Yeah, we have. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, John says, John 1:14, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. We saw his beauty, but not like we're going to see it. We're going to see it. He's going to come when we reign with him, the king on the throne. We, his princes and princesses, we're going to reign with him as his co-regents. And we're going to reign in righteousness because he's going to remove the propensity to sin from us. The power of sin going to be taken away. And what a picture. Those blessings of the future have reached back and changed our lives today. But one day, the change is going to be cosmic and universal and physical. And somebody asked me yesterday, they said, how long do you think the Lord's going to let all this stuff go on? I said, I hope he's tired of it by tomorrow. When I read Isaiah's description, both of God's judgment and of God's grace, I say, even so, come Lord Jesus. I'm ready to go rule with Christ, aren't you? And may it be so. It'd be great if he'd come right now. What a great sermon illustration that would be. I always, every time I talk about the coming of Christ, I'm like, Lord, if you'd do it right now, that would just be awesome. So in anticipation of that, we live for Christ. We'll take a break and grab yourself a cup of coffee, use the restroom, meet our guest. We've got some folks that are here, come from Illinois, passing through from Ridgecrest, came to worship with us today. I know we've got other guests. Make sure that you meet them, and let's welcome each other on this Lord's Day morning.